So we are right at 2 o'clock, and I see that people are starting to arrive. We've got over 20 people that have logged in now. We have 50 that are registered. So we're going to give them just a couple of more minutes for people to fight their way through the GoToWebinar interface, and then we'll get started. So please, thank you for your patience. All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a healthy number of people on the line, and of course, there will be a recording available for those who show up late. So this is the webinar, Changing the Subject on Climate Change, for the River Network and its members. So thank you all for coming, and thanks to the River Network for hosting us on this event. We've got some very exciting results to share with you. I think you'll find this is all very relevant given the timing. And here's our agenda for the day. We're going to start with some introductions and some acknowledgements. We'll brief you a little bit on the background of the project that we're going to be discussing today and why we did it and who we did it for. And then we're going to share some research highlights. We're going to share results from a literature review, a survey, boil it down to the bottom line, and then walk you through some of the resources that we have available. We're going to ask you to hold your questions until the end. If you do send a question through the chat box, we'll be able to get to that at the end of the call, but we want to, in the interest of making sure we don't run long or run too short, we'll do the formal presentation in the beginning, and then we'll take questions at the end. So I'm going to introduce the panelists. So I'm Eckl, that's me on the right. I'm the founder and owner of Words That Work. We're a marketing and public relations firm that works exclusively for people like yourselves. Little known fact is that the phrase Words That Work was used first. The first time that was used was as the title for a breakout session at a river rally in like 2004. And it was so well received at the river rally in Wintergreen, West Virginia, that I knew I was onto something. And before long, we had a public relations and marketing firm. We've worked with dozens and dozens of river groups all across the country, and really glad to have you all on the line here right now. Kelly, I'm going to turn the line over to you and let you introduce yourself.
Great. Thanks, Eric. You can hear me, right?
I can.
Okay, good. So my name's Kelly Watkinson, and I am the program manager for the Land Trust Alliance's Land and Climate Program. And in just a few minutes, I'll be telling you a little bit more about what we do with that program and a little bit more about the Alliance. So I'll just stop there.
All right. So a couple of acknowledgments before we dive in. One of our partners on this project was the Open Space Institute. And the work that we are going to be sharing with you was funded by the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. The primary client here for Words was Land Trust Alliance, which you might well think of as the River Network for Land Trusts. That would be a very simple way of describing who they are and what they do. And so it's important to understand that all of the research that I'm going to be sharing here with you today was designed to be of assistance to the Land Trust Alliance and their member organizations. In the great grand scheme of things, local land trusts and local watershed and river groups have a whole lot in common. And in particular, I think you would find that the demographics of those who support watershed organizations and those who support land trusts are closer than not when compared with any other groups of people that you might imagine. Of course, there are some distinctions, but in the big picture, these two groups have a lot in common, and I'm really confident that you'll find that many of the findings are going to be quite relevant to all of you as well. So we're going to talk now just a little bit about the background of the project itself before diving into the actual research findings. And so I am going to take it on to the next slide, and I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly.
Great. Thanks, Eric. And thanks again to all of you for joining us today and sharing a little bit of background on this project to kick things off. So at the Land Trust Alliance, we operate under the assumption that climate change is here and it's already impacting local communities and the work that land trusts are doing. I imagine, like in the case of land trusts, climate change is forcing river organizations to look at their work through a new lens as well. In our experience, land trusts are realizing that business as usual will not cut it anymore, and they're really interested in understanding how climate change will not only impact the communities that they work in, but the natural resources that are part of their mission that they're working to protect. They're also looking to understand what actions they can take as an organization to help prepare for and address this very big and overwhelming challenge. Climate change impacts can be felt very differently depending on your location. For example, in the western U.S., wildfires and droughts represent some of the biggest challenges. In the east, flooding is a huge concern. The graphic on this slide shows climate disasters from 2019. If you look at this same graphic from 2017 and 2018, it really just illustrates that climate impacts are being felt in all regions across the country, so all regions where land trusts work. No, you're good, Eric. Next slide. So in 2017, with a generous Catalyst grant from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, the Alliance launched our Land and Climate program. This program was specifically designed to help land trusts address climate change. And we're guided by three primary goals: increasing the number of land trusts equipped with strategic conservation plans that address climate impacts and promote climate resilience. Eric will tell you later you probably shouldn't use the word resilience, but I'm going to use it right now anyway. Advancing the use of land through restoration, protection, and management to maximize nature's ability to keep greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and empowering land trusts to facilitate the build-out of renewable energy facilities while steering those facilities away from the most sensitive lands. So when we started this work, we learned pretty quickly that land trusts needed help communicating internally within their own organizations and externally with their community, with their members, with their landowners about climate change. And to get down to it, they had a lot of trouble communicating about how their work locally was connecting to meaningful climate actions. And so this communication challenge was really the impetus for engaging Waterwords that work in this project. So to give you a sense of the type of work that land trusts are doing and in turn needing to communicate about, I just wanted to share a few quick examples from land trusts that are really leading in this space. In land trusts like Lakes Region Conservation Trust in New Hampshire are really leading by both bringing climate science into their strategic conservation planning, as well as innovating in the carbon market space. The work they're doing is laying the groundwork for other land trusts in our field to be able to engage in this space. They're in the process of doing one of the first compliance carbon projects where a private landowner and a land trust are really joining forces and joining resources, being the lands that they both own, in order to develop a viable carbon project. Next slide. In Northwest Arkansas, the Northwest Arkansas Land Trust is leading by bringing climate science into their strategic conservation plans, but they have also developed a very robust climate educational program in a state that is fairly conservative. They're also putting a lot of effort into their climate communications and have some great resources that I use all the time as an example of how you should be talking about climate change to your audiences. And next slide. And last but not least, we have Scenic Hudson in New York. They've really incorporated climate change into all aspects of their work. They're doing planning for sea level rise and marsh migration. They're bringing climate science into their strategic conservation planning work, and they're really leading conversations around renewable energy siting in the Hudson River Valley and in the state of New York. And now I think I will turn it back over to you, Eric.
All right. Thank you, Kelly. And thanks for the opportunity to be of service to you guys on this project. So Land Trust Alliance and Open Space Institute put out an RFP looking for a communications firm to help local land trusts communicate clearly about what climate means for their work and what their work means for the climate. And we were the selected firm. We were grateful for that. And it wasn't a giant project, but we did have the resources to do two really important things. And one is a literature review. Climate communication has been very well studied, and there's plenty of useful information out there. So rather than thinking we had to start from scratch, we started by just going through everything that was available and trying to highlight the bits and pieces that would be most relevant to a local conservation organization. And then using the findings from that literature review, we crafted a survey which a bunch of land trusts circulated to their members so that we could hear straight from land trust supporters about their thoughts on the matter. And so let's get it down to at the very bottom line here. It's important to understand that most Americans accept that climate change is real. Most Americans accept that climate change is real. And arguing with the hardened deniers is futile. It is very easy to get drawn into an argument with a climate skeptic. But we are encouraging you here on this call to not get drawn into that. Don't waste your time trying to convince the view of someone who reads Breitbart every morning, and focus on reaching out to people who believe that it's real but aren't taking action or getting involved or being supportive for other reasons. And another really important thing to take away is that successful climate communication emphasizes the local consequences and the local solutions. A lot of times our messages are the environmental community writ large. We're missing the mark with polar bears and melting ice caps and what causes global warming, what causes the climate crisis, where land trusts and local watershed groups have the opportunities by emphasizing those local consequences and local solutions. Those are kind of the big high-level takeaways. So what I want you to do next is write down a guess. Just grab a piece of paper, and I want you to guess two things. What percentage of people in your state believe that global warming is real? And I use that word in this context on purpose, and you'll see why in just a second. And what percent believe it is caused by humans? I'll give you just a second to think that through and write your guess down. What percentage of people in your state believe that global warming is real? What percentage believe that it is caused by humans? And here's how you find out. So if you look on the lower left-hand corner of your screen there, you see a URL, http://bit.ly/pew-global. And if you type that link into another browser window, not the same one that the webinar is in, please, you'll find yourself looking at this map. And what this map is a super detailed map. You can search by state, by county, by all kinds of geographic criteria, and then you can find the percentages that they believe, through an extensive sampling effort, are likely to believe that global warming is real, that believe it's caused by humans, and various other things. So I'll give you just a minute to play with that and maybe look up the answer and see how close you were. Unfortunately, you can't search by watershed on this map. States, counties, and other congressional districts, metro areas, that's what you can search by. So depending on what you found, the national average is that 70% believe that global warming is happening. A very clear, solid majority of Americans believe that global warming is happening. But the percentage of people who believe that it's caused by humans is much lower at 53% nationally. So most Americans believe that it's happening, a clear majority believe that it's happening, and a bare majority believe that it's caused by humans. And it's important to know, to keep that in mind, is that as we focus in on humans as the cause of climate change, the more your message revolves around humans as the cause of climate change, the smaller the audience becomes that is accepting what you're talking about. If you focus on the fact that it's occurring and there are consequences and there are steps to be taken to prepare for it, a very large majority of Americans accept that. So let's talk a little bit about the research, and I'm going to start with the literature review. So we released this literature review on November 2017, 36 pages. I'm certainly not going to read the whole thing for you over the phone, but I'll talk about some of the highlights. We went through dozens and dozens and dozens of both peer-reviewed and gray literature, seeking answers to questions about communication and to come up with good advice to give to local land trusts. And here's some of what we found. Here are the top findings. And the first is that, most believe that it's occurring, but they lack a sense of urgency and are reluctant to act. Another important finding is that only a minority of Americans believe that global warming is a hoax. Only a minority believe that it's a hoax, but they are vocal and highly motivated. We found that the messages about climate that resonate with conservative Americans are persuasive to liberals, but the reverse is not true. And we inferred from many of our findings that local land trusts may be particularly influential in converting climate skeptics, and we would assume that local watershed associations would have some of the same opportunities for some of the very same reasons. So I'm going to focus in on that first one. Most believe that global warming is occurring. Most believe that it's caused by humans and could be addressed, but there's that sense of urgency and reluctance. Let's talk about that. Why do we know that? How does that come to be? And the first thing to understand is that even though we, professionals in the field, perceive that climate change is accelerating very rapidly, we perceive that the alarm bells are getting louder and louder and louder, public opinion on this matter is remarkably stable. So this is from the Yale Program on Climate Change, and as far back as 2008, 71% of Americans said that they believe that global warming is happening. Flash forward to 2017, and it's 70%. It's in the margin of error. There's only a very small period, if you look over this chart over more than a decade of polling, that the differences were outside of the margin of error. It's just little blips. This is as stable as any public opinion survey can possibly be. This is as stable as it gets. The climate is unstable, but opinion about the climate is remarkably stable. And if you did a little exercise clicking on the map and you found that, 70% of Americans believe it, and your state was 68% or 74%, you probably found that the difference between your state and the national average wasn't that much, because geographic differences on this subject are much less than conservation organizations tend to assume. So why aren't people acting if they believe that it's true? Well, they believe that it's real. 70% believe that it's happening, but only a minority believe that global warming is going to affect them. Only 14% believe that global warming, climate crisis, however you want to call it, is going to cause them personally a great deal of harm. And then another 27% believe it might cause them a moderate amount of harm. Most Americans feel, unfortunately, relatively secure from climate change, but they anticipate dire consequences kind of the further away you get. So it's not going to affect me very much, but it will affect the U.S. a lot. It'll affect people in developing countries, the poor of the world, the natural environment, future generations. As you move to the right of the chart and sort of out from the individual person participating in the survey, that sense of the consequences grows and grows. So for all that most Americans believe it's real, only a minority is seeing that it's going to really come home to roost on their lap. Perhaps even more important than that is the ability to do anything about it. It's a majority, a clear majority, who feel helpless, somewhat helpless or very helpless, to do anything about global warming. So that kind of is what really explains what's going on with most of the public as a whole. Yeah, they believe it's real, but they're not sure it's going to hit them. And even if they knew that, they're just really not sure what they could do. And so it's those two buttons that we need to push to get some action around the climate crisis, that it's going to affect you and that there's something that you can do about it. And so I got this little image here that I pulled together to illustrate that, because the gentleman on the right is a conservation person. And we tend to fall into the trap of trying to convince people that climate change is really happening. And we think if we could just convince them that it's really happening, then something will start to occur. But what we really need to do, the gentleman on the left is thinking, he's got to convince me that it's going to affect me, and he's got to convince me that there's something that I can do about it if it will. That's the core communications challenge right there in a nutshell. So our second big finding is that there's really only a minority of Americans who believe that it is a hoax. Only a small fraction of the population are actual, hardened, dyed-in-the-wool, vocal, assertive climate deniers. And the Yale Program on Climate Communication, they did a really groundbreaking study that found 6 major schools of public opinion around climate out there. And the one that we're going to be talking about now is called the dismissive. The dismissive, those who are flat-out deniers of climate change. And what do we find? They make up about 10% of the population. It's only about 1 in 10 that really are hardcore opponents. Demographically, that group tends to be very conservative white men with high education income. Not solely, of course, but disproportionately. The dismissive are civically active. They may well be evangelical Christians. They prioritize the economy over the environment. really important for our purposes here today is that these dismissive individuals tend to consume a specialized media diet of conservative commentary. So now here's a chart that shows kind of the range of views and civic engagement across these groups. So the group is the alarmed. They are the most concerned about climate change, the most active about climate change. And as we move from alarmed to concerned to cautious to disengaged to doubtful and to dismissive, you see that their sense of the urgency of climate change falls. But when you get all the way over to the dismissive, their issue involvement goes back up. These are your active opponents on climate change. There's not very many of them, but they are quite loud. Now, I mentioned that they tend to consume a specialized diet of conservative media. Here's the kind of information the dismissive have immersed themselves in. New York Reporter demands you become hysterical about climate change. Remembering climate alarmists' false prophecies. That's from Breitbart. That 10% of hardened deniers, this is where they're getting most of their climate information. They are getting it from highly biased sources with an agenda, and the kind of information that you're exposed to, they're just not seeing it. Which is why it's a waste of time to argue with them. Now, one of the big takeaways is that the messages that resonate with conservative Americans are also persuasive to liberals, but the reverse is not true. There are certain messages about the climate which many of you on the phone most likely find to be quite persuasive, but conservative Americans do not. But many of the arguments that the conservative Americans find to be persuasive are persuasive to us, but so the reverse is not true. So some of the symbols that we found that were particularly appealing to conservative Americans: military, law enforcement, firefighters, patriotic symbols, and churches that are active in the community. And so now what does that mean for climate change? The military. Well, there are two branches of the military that have a lot to do with climate change, and one is the National Guard, and the other is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Conservative Americans are responsive to messages that paint these individuals and their sacrifice and service to the nation, and the stress that climate change will place on them, and take warnings that come out of these institutions more serious than you might expect from climate scientists and others. Now, invoking religion is always very perilous territory for conservation organizations, but if you look at it here in the context of this emergency truck, this is Georgia Baptist Disaster Relief Volunteers with their shower. You talk about communities that are religious institutions as active in the community, that is a go. If you try and give any kind of message like Jesus says, take care of the climate or whatever, that is a no-go. That seems insincere and manipulative to them. But when you talk about the good work that churches do to help people in need and what that means in a world of a changing climate, that is something that they can relate to and pay attention to. And of course, here we have patriotic symbols. I'm particularly fond of this dirty eagle in the forest fire. Now, I'm sure that many of you on the line have been through some of the waterworks training, and you've seen our short, handy list of language to use when you don't have specialized surveys and research like this one to guide you. We found that a lot of that language is really quite suitable when the topic is climate change, but there were some additional terms that were helpful to bring in when the topic is climate and the audience is conservative. So I added a couple of words to this list. So here are words from the list that you may have seen that are relevant to our particular challenge here: protect, family, safe, choice, fair, balance, etc. I've added two more when the topic is climate, referring to property. Forest fires hit property, floods hit property, droughts hit property, invasive pests hit property. many of the consequences of climate change hit property, and conservatives in particular are very conscious of their property. And then phrases like American tradition and patriotic resonate with conservative audiences as well. Now, the last finding from the literature review that I'm going to share with you is about the local land trusts, and I would assume watershed associations, for the same reason, may be particularly influential in convincing climate skeptics. And the reason for that is that what we found is that successful climate communication is about local consequences and solutions. It's not about rising CO2 levels. It's not about melting ice caps. It's not about disappearing polar caps. It's about floods, droughts, spread of insects, spread of disease, things that can be have a local consequence and a local solution. And as local watershed organizations, you have a lot of things that you can speak to on that. And a lot of times you'll find you don't even have to mention the climate at all. So as a local conservation organization, you're well positioned to gather photos of the local impacts. You're well positioned to gather stories of those who are affected by those impacts, tell stories of people who are making a difference locally, and these are the things that really allow you to connect with folks. If you make it a global issue or a national issue, that seems far off and far away. That's somebody else's problem. I don't know what to do about it. You make it a local issue, and you are going to get more attention from more people. Here's some of the photos I would encourage you to get whenever the opportunity presents itself. Here we have a woman who's holding up a piece of wood that was from a tree that was killed by an invasive pest whose range is expanding in the warmer world. We have the farmer whose fields are struggling in the drought. We have the woman in the remains of her home burned by a fire. We have the family escaping from a flood. These are among the most dramatic images that we could possibly tell, but they are the ones that tell the story of the climate crisis at a local level. A really good way of telling local consequence stories is with before and after images. So I got a selection here. Here we have before and after the forest fire. We have before and after the drought. Here we have before and after the flood. And here we have before and after the pest invasion. These are the kinds of stories that you, as a local conservation organization, can tell credibly. You have credibility on fires, droughts, floods, and invasive pests. You have less credibility on carbon dioxide, solar, renewable energy, melting ice caps, et cetera, et cetera. These are the stories that bring the issue home for people and that you are credible telling them. The research pointed towards best ways to tell solutions, and part of it is picking and choosing when you're going to show individuals versus social problems. So if you wanted to make the point that automobile emissions are a big contributor to global warming, showing a family by their SUV can make people defensive. But if you show all of the cars stuck in traffic on their way to work in the morning, it paints it as a social problem, it helps people recognize the scale, and it's less likely to make an individual family feel accused. Same thing about electricity consumption at home. If you show a picture of a woman installing a light bulb, people were going to relate to that. A lot of people are going to relate to being that woman. I got to have light bulbs in my house, and it'll put them on the defensive, and then they'll shut you down. But if you show at the aggregate, a big giant power plant makes people recognize the same, they can connect the problem in the same way, but they are less defensive when the problems are presented in this way. Now, the same goes for showing solutions. If you show a close-up, like this gentleman here on the bicycle, you can kind of make the point for this is how it's done. This is how we fight climate change. But it's the picture of lots of people riding their bike that show how it makes a difference for climate change. Same here with the sign, Preserved Farm. Showing the sign up close shows what one person can do, but it's this aerial view at scale that shows how one preserved farm makes a big difference for the environment. As local conservation organizations, you are well positioned to show local actions that people can take. Carpooling, solar panels going on a home, we've got land preservation, we've got people putting fire breaks around their home. These are all legit stories that you can tell with credibility. Now, there's been a lot of debate about what do you call it? Is it global warming? Is it climate change? What's it called? Well, the most recent surveys on the issue find that global warming and climate change are pretty much the same when it comes to the general public's response. You can use those words interchangeably with the general public, and the reaction is going to be more or less the same. But since we conducted this literature review, new language came out that I find to be highly credible. And this is from a outfit called Spark, the Spark Agency, and they did. They hooked a bunch of people up to EKG machines and measured their brain activity. And what they reported is that the phrase "climate crisis" is the big winner, with 60% more emotional response than climate change or global warming. Climate crisis. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, but of course, climate crisis is alliterative, the k sound, and then it rhymes, climate crisis. So there's alliteration and rhyme. Those things are very good. And of course, crisis is accurate. It is the truth, and it has an emotional spin to it that climate change and global warming do not. So I find this research to be highly compelling and credible. I would encourage all of you participating in this webinar to try the phrase climate crisis and see if that doesn't help a little bit. But now there are definitely terms that you should avoid, and one of them is resilience. This is Lori Weigel here. She's a pollster for Land Trust Alliance and Trust for Public Land and others. And she has, what she's saying here is she tested resilience with more than 20 focus groups. Focus groups are very expensive. That's $250,000 worth of research or more that's going behind her recommendation that you avoid the term resilience outside of your professional peer group. Confusing and counterproductive. So the literature review set us up to do a survey of land trust supporters, and here is what we found. So we had 16 land trusts participate. And what they did is they did an email survey to their email list. So this is somewhat informal way of doing research. I'll be upfront with you about it. It is somewhat informal, but we collected 1,282 responses. So we have a huge sample. So that's good. And one of the big findings I'd like you to understand is that a majority of land trust supporters, and it is my assumption that the majority of watershed organization supporters would be the same, do support land trust talking about climate change. Here we had 58% saying yes, and another 23% saying probably. So for the vast majority, a very strong majority of your supporters, they're not going to be turned off by climate crisis messages coming out of your organization. Let me say that again. The vast majority of your supporters are not going to be turned off by climate crisis messages coming out of your organizations. A small percentage will, and they'll be vocal about it. Now, local conservation organizations are very focused on geography. We're geography geeks. But we analyzed the difference between our land trust supporters in the Northeast and in the Southeast, and we found that the difference in views by region were negligible. And this is the same as the map exercise we did at the top of the webinar. The geographic differences and attitudes about the climate crisis are actually quite small. Demographic differences count for a lot. Geographic differences don't count for that much on this topic. The differences between our northeastern and southeastern survey responses are within the margin of error for the question as a whole. If you see climate message research that is conducted in a different part of the country, don't discount it. Geographic differences are a lot less than you think. Now, of the land trust supporters that we surveyed, only between 6 and 8% of them were highly negative about the climate messages that we ran at them. Roughly the same percentage that Yale would say is dismissive. So again, there are climate skeptics in your membership. There are climate skeptics maybe on your board, but they are a small minority. The vast majority are perfectly comfortable hearing climate messages coming out from you guys. But that said, it's kind of a trap. This is, of course, a Star Wars character who is best known for saying, "It's a trap." For all that land trust supporters and your supporters are willing to hear about climate change, it doesn't necessarily mean it's as urgent for them as it is for you. So we presented the questions this way in our survey. Topics that they want to hear about land trusts. We found that the climate crisis was 6 out of 9. And as reasons for land trust supporters to protect the land that they own, it was 5th out of 8. Middle of the pack. The traditional land trust messages about the mission of the land trust and the benefits to a family for preserving their land, those traditional messages are more persuasive to the landowners, more persuasive to the land trust supporters than climate messages. So they don't mind hearing about it, but it's not the message that pushes them over the top. And again, as reasons that they might donate money to a land trust or reasons they might volunteer for a land trust, we found that climate was middle of the pack or below. And many of the traditional messages about the mission of the land trust are more compelling to them. So here's how we interpret that. Land trust supporters, they are receptive about climate messages, but they're not expecting it. The connection, they don't really see the connection between the mission that they came to you supporting and the climate. You're going to have to make that connection for them. There are many people who support watershed associations because they love to go fishing, they love to go paddling, they live along the water and they want the river to be clean, they love motorboating, they have some personal tie to that water body, and we know that climate has got them in the crosshairs. They don't see it quite as well. They think that the consequences of the climate crisis are far away in the future and far off around the planet. It's up to us to make that connection, that these problems are right here, right now. Even if they do recognize that the consequences of the problem are right here, right now, they are not sure what they can do about it, and it's up to us to emphasize that there are local solutions and they can play a meaningful role in those. They're not expecting those messages from you. They are receptive to it, but you've got to connect those dots. They can't connect them without you being very explicit about it. So here's the quick bottom line. 7 out of 10 believe it's happening. More than 5 out of 10 believe it's caused by humans. But only 1 out of 6 really believes that climate change is going to hit them close to home. And only 1 and more than half feel helpless to do anything about it anyway. So it's up to you to make the case. It's happening. Don't worry about saying it's caused by humans. You don't get anything for that. Convince them that it's going to affect them close to home. Convince them that there is something that they can do about it, and the number of people that will participate will go up. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking you have to convince them that climate change is happening, but it's more important to convince them that it will affect them and there's something that they can do about it, and that you are a leader on the issue. So now we've got some resources that came out of this project that we'll be sharing with you. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly to explain what they've got.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Regarding resources, I'd like to point out the Alliance has an entire website dedicated to conservation in a changing climate. From this slide, you can see, there's all kinds of different topics, renewable energy, communications, natural climate solutions, building resilience. If you go back a slide, there is a report that the Alliance and the Open Space Institute put together. Eric, go back one slide. That based on the work that Waterwords at Work did, and it's this report, How to Talk About Climate Change, that's available on this website for download. We also have included a copy in the handout section of the webinar, so you can just download it if you want, and it includes a lot of the information that Eric went over with you just now. Okay, you can go to the next slide. But when you're on the website, you can search for climate information based on land types, based on regions of the country. Next slide. We have a lot of case studies, and these are write-ups about land trusts, mostly land trusts, across the country doing climate work. So you can search the case studies by different topics, adaptation or mitigation, carbon finance, those types of things. You can also browse all of the information by the climate impact, depending on what things you are looking for. Next slide. And under the communications tab, we have a lot of different resources, including this communications product analysis case study. I think there's about 4 of these analyses that were put together, and it basically looked at actual communications products that were created by land trusts in the land trust community. And honestly, when we were starting this project, we were having a really hard time even finding examples, much less good examples. So it just went to show us that, groups are really needing help on this and really needing encouragement to start, putting this out there in their communications to the public, to their members. But on here, this analysis takes a look at some of these publications that different land trusts put together and kind of walks through the different places where they may have utilized some of these tips or suggestions that we have kind of as recommendations for talking about climate change. And next slide. Also, as part of their work, and because we kept hearing over and over, that there just weren't a lot of examples out there and other land trusts, and I'm sure it's the same in the watershed community, watershed organization community, but land trusts like to share and sort of copy off of each other. So having examples of things that one land trust is doing, is really important because land trusts are always using each other's stuff and building off of each other's work. And so we created a climate communications inventory. So on the website, you can get to this. The web address is down at the bottom of the slide. It's a little bit hidden, I will admit. But once you get there, you can see a bunch of different organizations or a bunch of different communications materials, as well as the audience, the grade level of sort of what it was written for, the type of audience level, and then the types of communications products. And that's all I have, Eric, I think. That's my last slide.
The last resource I'd like to offer you guys is a shameless shelf promotion. We took the findings of the literature review and the survey and other sources, and we've turned it into one of our signature 3-part trainings. Many of you on the line have probably been through some of these trainings. We call it Changing the Subject on Climate. We offer these trainings as free 90-minute webinars for a very low cost, or as an on-site full-day training experience for a slightly higher cost. 3 90-minute sessions that goes deep into some of the things that we have alluded to here today, with lots of hands-on exercises to help people, help you and your other staff and your partners actually take bad climate messages and turn them into good climate messages. So if you are interested in maybe having us do that training for you guys online or in person, our contact information will be up very shortly on the slide. And speaking of our contact information, there it is. Kelly's on the left. There's her email address and phone number. I'm on the right. There's my email address and phone number. That brings us to the end of our presentation, and we've got 10 minutes left for questions. So we do have a River Network staff person on the line who has been monitoring the chats. And we're going to go ahead and open the floor for questions.
I have a question here from Angela, who asks if we should not use the word resilience, what is the recommended alternative?
Safe, responsible, planning ahead, secure. You'd have to rewrite the sentence to use those words. It's not a straight up one-for-one sub, I'm afraid. But the term resilience is it just doesn't work. People don't know what you're talking about. They don't get it. So the way it always works with jargon is take a concept like we got to plan ahead for floods and droughts and secure the community in the face of this or that problem, and we turn it into one word. If you're a professional in the field, that's efficient and that's a good thing. When you're going out to those outside of our professional field, one word like resilience turns into a sentence.
Great. Liz is curious about the training. She's wondering if you could go back one slide so they can capture that information. Perfect. Any other questions out there?
If Liz wants to send me an email, I will hook her up with someone who can answer all of her questions.